Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really important question. How does the visual media young girls consume, things like internet games, films, TV, video games? How does it shape their view of their bodies? And what they dream of doing with their lives, and even how they understand what it means to be a girl.
Yeah, it's a huge
Yeah.
topic. And for this exploration, you've shared a really compelling set of resources with us. We've got a scientific study that zooms right in on appearance-focused internet games.
Right.
There are also reports looking into conscious parenting and media literacy, which feels crucial here, plus articles dissecting some harmful ways women are often shown in media, looking at the male gaze, gender in video
And
games.
even a Reddit thread, which I thought was interesting, discussing good and bad examples of female characters in games.
Exactly, so a really rich mix.
Our goal really is to try and get a proper handle on the potential influence of all these media messages and maybe figure out some, practical ways to help young girls engage with media more critically, more thoughtfully.
Right, where to start?
Okay, so let's dive right into this University of the West of England study, the one that looked at those dream date dress-up type games.
Yes, that study is quite revealing, I think. It looked at the immediate impact of playing one of these appearance-focused games, specifically on girls aged 8 and 9.
Okay.
And what's kind of fascinating is how quickly it seemed to affect them. They had one group play Dream Date Dress Up for just 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yeah, just 10 minutes. And the other group played a neutral game, Penguin Diner, I think it was called.
Okay, and the difference that 10 minutes made was pretty significant, right?
Absolutely. The girls who played the dress-up game, they showed a greater level of body dissatisfaction, like right afterwards compared to the Penguin game group.
Wow.
And it wasn't just a fleeting thought. It actually translated into a stronger desire for a thinner body, both for, how they saw themselves right then and how they imagined themselves in the future.
So even that short burst.
Even a short session with these kinds of games can have a surprisingly swift impact on body image.
10 minutes. It really makes you think about the constant sort of drip feed of these images. Um, the researchers also mentioned, didn't they, that a similar study, but with younger girls, like 3 to 6-year-olds, looking at film clips about appearance, didn't find the same immediate effect.
That's right.
What could, explain that difference?
Well, that's a really insightful point to consider. It could be that 8 and 9-year-olds just have a more developed sense of body image already. They might be more aware of societal beauty standards compared to preschoolers.
Okay.
Plus, the interactive nature of games probably plays a pretty crucial role.
Ah.
When you're actively involved, creating and embodying a character whose whole point is appearance, maybe those messages just sink in more deeply than if you're just passively watching a film.
That makes a lot of sense. And the actual premise of Dream Date Dress Up, it's so specific, isn't it? You're literally changing a character's looks to appeal to some boy's idea of a perfect date.
Exactly. It's directly linking a girl's value to how she looks, but through someone else's eyes. And it likely reinforces a very, very narrow and frankly unrealistic ideal.
Yeah.
And this lines up perfectly with sociocultural theory, this idea that kids are really receptive to messages from their environment, media included. And they might not yet have the critical thinking skills to really analyze or question those messages properly.
And mass media is just such a powerful source of these idealized, often sexualized images, the thin ideal being a prime example.
It's everywhere.
And it's not just this one study raising alarms. We have meta-analyses in our sources, right? They look at a much broader range of research on this.
Precisely. And these wider analyses consistently show a link between media exposure and, well, negative outcomes for girls under 19. Things like poorer body image, lower self-esteem, disordered eating patterns, even decreased emotional well-being.
It's quite a list.
It is. And even studies looking at really young girls, like 6 years old, have found correlations between consuming media magazines, TV, and starting to internalize that thin ideal, feeling dissatisfied with their bodies, and unbelievably even being aware of dieting.
6. Wow, that is such a young age to be thinking about dieting or feeling bad about your body.
Yeah.
And this constant exposure, it also ties into the idea of sexualization, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Research suggests that exposure to sexualized content can even influence young girls' preferences, like for more sexualized clothing styles. And this all connects to the concept of self-objectification, which is another really important piece our sources explore.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Self-objectification. What does that actually mean, and how does media feed into it?
So in essence, self-objectification is when girls start to internalize this idea that their main worth comes from their physical appearance and how other people see them. And It's often fueled by just repeated exposure to media that portrays women as objects, things to be looked at and judged based on their looks, rather than as, whole individuals with agency, thoughts, feelings, abilities.
So the constant stream of these images can lead girls to start seeing themselves through that external lens.
Exactly. They adopt this sort of outside viewer's perspective on their own bodies.
And this shift in perspective, the research shows it can have some really negative consequences.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Self-objectification has been linked to lower self-esteem, um, decreased life satisfaction, more negative body image, feelings of shame, and a higher risk of developing disordered eating.
It sounds quite pervasive.
It can be. And the UK study we talked about earlier, they actually tried to measure the immediate impact of the games on self-objectification too.
Right, they used that modified 20 statements test.
Yeah.
How did that work here?
So after playing either the dress-up game or the penguin game, the girls were asked to complete 3 sentences starting with I am. And the researchers then looked at those statements to see how often the girls described themselves based on their body shape, their size, or just general physical appearance. It gave them an indication, I guess, of whether playing the appearance-focused game made them more likely to define themselves by their looks, at least in that moment.
So even a really brief encounter with this kind of media can subtly shift how young girls see themselves, pushing appearance right to the forefront. It's a really troubling picture when you think about the cumulative effect over time.
It really is.
Now let's pivot a bit to another key area our sources cover, how media might influence career aspirations and also our understanding of gender roles. The UK study touched on this as well, didn't it?
Yes, they did. They looked at the girls' career cognitions, basically, their thoughts and beliefs about different jobs.
Right.
And what was interesting there was that while the type of game didn't seem to change the jobs the girls thought they were capable of doing.
Okay, so they didn't suddenly think they couldn't be a doctor after playing the dress-up game.
Exactly. No change there.
Yeah.
But it did influence their preferences.
Ah, and what did they find about those preferences?
The girls who played the appearance-focused game, they showed a stronger preference for careers that are traditionally seen as feminine compared to the girls who played the neutral game.
That's subtle.
It is subtle, but it suggests that even without explicitly saying girls do this or boys do that, these games can kind of nudge young girls towards more gender stereotypical career paths. It just highlights how media can shape those unconscious biases we have about what's, appropriate for different genders.
That's a really interesting, subtle, but potentially powerful influence. And it really lines up with what our other sources are telling us about how gender is generally portrayed across different media, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, women are consistently underrepresented in media pretty much everywhere you look, which can send this quiet message that men are the default, the cultural standard, and women are somehow less central or visible.
Okay.
And then when women are shown, they're often depicted in really stereotypical ways that just reinforce traditional ideas about what men and women should be like.
And we see that in how relationships are shown too, right? Female dependence, male independence.
Exactly. So those dynamics get played out over and over. Female characters often dependent on male characters, men portrayed as independent, in control. It just shores up traditional gender arrangements.
Yeah.
And even in stuff made specifically for kids, like children's TV shows, commercials, female characters from minority groups, they're often stuck in supporting roles rather than being the main focus or the leaders.
And it's not just about who's there, but how they're presented. Our sources talk about the male gaze. Can you maybe explain that concept a bit more conversationally?
Sure. So the male gaze basically describes how media films, ads, you name it, often presents women from the perspective of a heterosexual man.
Okay.
This often means women are sexualized, their physical appearance is emphasized, sort of for the pleasure of this assumed male viewer.
Right, objectified.
Objectified, exactly. Their looks become more important than their actions, their goals, their inner thoughts. And for young girls watching this, it can send this really damaging message that their main value lies in how visually appealing they are to men, which is incredibly limiting and can definitely fuel insecurity.
Like they're being taught their worth is tied to meeting a certain visual standard. One of our articles also mentioned this "I'm not like other girls" thing. How does that fit in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of complex dynamic.
Yeah.
Sometimes girls try to distance themselves from negative female stereotypes by rejecting traditionally feminine things, interests, traits, whatever, saying, oh, I'm not like those girls.
Right, I've heard that.
But ironically, by doing that, they can sometimes end up reinforcing the very patriarchal structures they're trying to push against,
Yeah.
because they're essentially agreeing that traditionally feminine things are bad or less valuable.
I see. So even trying to break free can paradoxically kind of reinforce the system.
It can, yeah. It's
Yeah.
tricky.
Okay, so let's focus in on animated content for a minute. Cartoons. Such a big part of media for young kids. What do our sources say about gender stereotypes there?
Well, cartoons are incredibly powerful socializing agents for kids, shaping their expectations about gender. And this happens through, the repeated behaviors and traits shown by different characters.
And the patterns aren't always great.
Unfortunately, no. A common pattern is depicting female characters as, well, weaker, maybe less intelligent, often confined to domestic roles or needing rescue, while male characters are frequently shown as strong, capable, dominant problem solvers.
One of our sources looks specifically at Indian cartoon series, which gives a fascinating cultural angle. What did that analysis find?
Yeah, that was interesting. Their analysis identified several recurring character types based on gender. They found these hegemonic males, usually the protagonists, the ones who resolve conflicts.
Okay.
Then submissive or inadequate males, often portrayed as frail or just used for comic relief.
Right.
And then fragile females, whose clothing and general demeanor often limited what they could actually do. They also noted a newer type, modern females, who were maybe a bit more active in solving problems, but still portrayed as quite delicate.
And what about villains versus heroes? Any gender patterns there?
Yes, the study found villains were very often male and female characters, frequently stuck in supporting roles or, the classic damsel in distress needing a male hero to save her.
So again, a lack of strong, active female protagonists.
Exactly, which just reinforces the idea that girls are passive or less capable.
It really paints a pretty consistent picture of these stereotypes across various media. Now let's turn our attention to video games. They're just huge, especially for young people. Our sources really highlight their popularity and influence.
Oh, absolutely. Gaming is a massive online activity for kids. A huge percentage of Americans play video games. And it's not just the games themselves. There's this whole influential subculture around it. Online blogs, websites, magazines, big conventions.
Right, and those video game magazines, they're really popular with teens, aren't they? Seen as trustworthy sources.
Very much so. Although it's worth noting, the readership is overwhelmingly male, something like 93%, with an average age in the mid-20s.
Okay, so given that reach and maybe that demographic, how are women and girls typically portrayed? Both in the games, based on what the magazines show, and in the magazines themselves.
Well, when you analyze the images in those magazines, some pretty clear and honestly concerning patterns jump out. Male characters, frequently hypermasculine, exaggerated muscles, aggressive expressions, very dominant stances.
Okay, and female characters.
Often depicted as, well, visions of beauty, but highly sexualized. Lots of skin showing, provocative poses, outfits that are just completely impractical, revealing.
So even in a medium with potential for incredible creativity, we often default to these narrow stereotypes for both men and women. What about aggression? How does that play out?
Aggression is common for both, actually. Over 80% of male characters and around 62% of female characters in these magazine images were depicted aggressively, often posing with weapons, looking menacing.
Interesting that it's high for both.
It is.
Yeah.
And what's also striking is how these stereotypes overlap. For women, a significant chunk showed multiple stereotypes at once: sexualized, scantily clad, and presented as just a beautiful object, all rolled into one. And similarly for men, hypermasculinity and aggression very often went hand in hand.
It's like these magazines are setting a very specific, often kind of harmful template for what it means to be male or female in the gaming world. And our sources even suggest these stereotypes are so common that even non-gamers recognize them.
Exactly. One study showed teenage non-gamers these character images, and they could easily identify the stereotypical gender portrayals. It shows how pervasive these images have become in the wider culture, beyond just the gaming community.
Now, to make this a bit more concrete, that Reddit discussion you mentioned earlier gave some specific examples, didn't it? Both problematic and maybe more positive portrayals in actual games. What stood out there?
Yeah, it was a lively discussion.
Yeah.
On the, let's say, problematic side, people mentioned things like EDI's humanoid form in Mass Effect 3. Some felt that was just unnecessarily sexualized.
Okay.
Morrigan's outfit in Dragon Age. Origins was brought up as Pretty unrealistic for a powerful sorceress wandering through forests.
Right.
And Ivy's costumes in the Soul Calibur fighting games often came up as examples of being overly revealing, maybe gratuitously so. The criticism was often that it didn't really serve the character of the story.
Okay. And on the more encouraging side, were there examples people pointed to as being better?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Elena Fisher from the Uncharted series often gets praised. She's seen as capable, smart, adventurous, but not overtly sexualized in her design.
Okay, good example.
Faith from Mirror's Edge also came up. And people mentioned a Tumblr blog called Women Fighters, which specifically highlights more diverse, less objectified female characters in fantasy art and games. There's definitely a desire out there, visible in that discussion, for more nuance, more realism, more multi-dimensional female characters.
It's clear that the media young girls are taking in across all these different forms, games, TV, films, even simple web games, can have a really significant impact on how they see themselves, how they see the world. So what can actually be done? What practical steps can we take? Our sources talk about media literacy and conscious parenting.
Yeah, emphasizing critical media literacy feels absolutely essential. We need to equip kids with the skills to actually question the media they encounter.
How do we do that?
Well, encourage them to think critically about the messages being sent. Ask questions like, who created this? Why? What values are being promoted? How are different groups represented? Are there underlying biases here?
Right.
It's also really important to help them understand the difference between, say, healthy expressions of sexuality and the kind of unhealthy sexualization of young people we often see in media. Promoting, strong feminist perspectives and critical media literacy can be really powerful tools to help kids counteract some of these harmful media scripts.
And what about for parents and educators? What can they do more directly?
Well, conscious parenting here really involves being actively aware of the media young girls are engaging with, knowing what games they're playing, what shows they're watching.
Just paying attention.
Exactly. And maybe considering limiting exposure to content that heavily pushes appearance or reinforces really limiting gender stereotypes, but also just creating space for open conversations. Talking about this stuff at home or in the classroom can really encourage that critical thinking about the messages they're constantly receiving.
It also feels like there's a responsibility on the part of the people creating this media, and maybe those setting broader policies too. Oh, absolutely. We should be challenging game developers, marketers, filmmakers to create engaging, appealing content that doesn't rely on these outdated gender stereotypes and narrow beauty ideals. There's so much creative potential out there.
Yeah.
And policymakers could also look at ways to maybe reduce or even eliminate products that actively promote harmful stereotypes, recognizing the real impact these can have on young people's development.
It's definitely a complex issue, as our sources point out. I mean, media is just so woven into our daily lives now.
It really is.
And challenging these deeply ingrained societal views on gender and media representation.
Yeah.
It's going to be an ongoing process, isn't it? It needs effort from lots of different angles.
It really does. It requires a multifaceted approach. We need to foster critical consumption habits in young people, provide conscious guidance, and advocate for more responsible, more diverse portrayals in the media itself. It's not just one thing. So, to kind of bring it all together, our deep dive today has really shown us how even, brief exposure to appearance-focused media can negatively impact young girls' body image and potentially even steer their career preferences towards more traditional paths.
Yeah, that link was clear.
We've also seen how media frequently underrepresents women and often portrays them in stereotypical ways, reinforcing those traditional gender roles and that pervasive male gaze. And specifically in the world of video games and their marketing, those hypersexualized and aggressive depictions of female characters are still way too common.
Unfortunately, yes.
But importantly, we've also explored how critical media literacy and conscious parenting can be really crucial tools to empower young girls to navigate these messages and hopefully develop a stronger, healthier sense of who they are.
Absolutely. And I think this leaves us with a really important question to ponder, something for you, the listener, to think about too. How can we as a society, collectively work together to reshape these narratives in media? How can we make media that truly celebrates the diverse, multifaceted nature of womanhood and empowers young girls to define their own worth based on who they are, their abilities, their passions, rather than just how they look?
And what responsibility do we each hold in that? As consumers choosing what we watch or play, as creators perhaps, and as policymakers, where does the responsibility lie for making that shift happen?